Now, ladies and gentlemen, the great Antonio. Ma pourquoi donc tu as brisé ma corps? Et ma pourquoi donc n'ayez un tel bonheur?
One of the first videos that picked up traction on this channel was the original Wrestling Gets Real video. The centerpiece for that was an encounter between Antonio Enoki and a bearded man clad in chains, bright yellow pants, and a rope around his waist, named The Great Antonio. The comments of the video were inevitably filled with people asking who this guy was and why he was anywhere near a ring with Antonio Enoki. The world of wrestling was a very different one at that time, and the Great Antonio was a perfect example of why it was so different. Today, we will tell the story of the man who tried to test the tiger in front of the world. Before we begin, we should probably let people in on the secret that this man did not come out of nowhere in the professional or pop culture sense to just arrive in the ring with Enoki, and was actually one of the more interesting characters or personalities you would bump into during this era of television. However, he did come out of nowhere as far as his origin. It is assumed he migrated in his youth to North America from Yugoslavia and began his new life. Given the war-torn environment and extremely poor conditions, it was understandable that he was never one to talk about the trials of his youth. He set foot on the mean streets of Nova Scotia off the boat, and immediately was on a path to becoming a local celebrity, between doing odd work for money, as he had been working with picks and shovels by the age of 6, allegedly. One thing that did stick with him from his youth was the ability to use cables in conjunction with his strength to perform feats for crowds of people. It is said that by the age of 11 or 12, he was able to wrap cables around trees and yank them from the ground. This was something that would propel him into the public eye by having not one, but 2 of his feats of strength done with these cables recorded by the Guinness Book of World Records. The 6'4", 465 pound, 211 kilogram man was able to sit down at tables and eat 25 chickens or a dozen steaks. The first was the case of Antonio pulling a train that weighed 433 tons, a distance of around 20 meters. And the other was for pulling 4 busloads of passengers down the street for a TV spot. Quickly, the legend of Antonio grew no matter where he would go due to his bizarre looks and mannerisms. In being hungry for the spotlight and fame, Antonio would cultivate a wild man persona that would stay with him and, for the most part, do right by him in his early years. The strongman was getting noticed by television, news, and, as you all know by now, wrestling promoters. During this time, wrestling was known for taking someone whom the public was aware of and saw as legitimate to bring in and put with their guys to keep the wrestling is a legitimate contest illusion going strong. And Antonio was next in line to be brought into the fold. With Antonio's growing legend, it was quickly noticed by promoters all over the world that there was something to be gained by having him involved in helping their stars to look tougher by facing him in the ring for the crowds. Originally, he completed under the name Narcissus, but luckily for Lex Luger's 1993 run in the WWF, he quickly changed his ring name to the Great Antonio, which would be the name he would stick with for the remainder of his days.
Now, I want to fight Muhammad Ali for $100 million, anytime, anywhere. Hey, come on! I want to break him to bits.
Though he had had a few matches around different territories, the first promoter to take note of the Great Antonio and really capitalise on him would be Stampede Wrestling's Stu Hart. Bret Hart's father bringing in the big man led to Bret becoming a huge fan of the strongman, watching him win 2v1 handicap matches and over-the-top rope battle royales on a regular basis. Bret was such a fan of the Great Antonio that his brother once had hurt him while playing, and to prevent Bret from telling on him, he promised Bret an autographed photo of the Great Antonio for his collection. Bret didn't tattle on his brother, and sure enough, his brother kept his word and Bret was given what he would call his most prized photo in the collection at the time. During this time in Stampede, he would even get to face the biggest star of the promotion in many's eyes, Terrible Ted, the Wrestling Bear. Due to both of them not being comfortable putting the other over, the man and the bear had pull-apart draws. Seriously. During this time with Stampede, the Great Antonio is credited with a riot after winning Stampede's North American Heavyweight Championship. No matter where he went, the Great Antonio was making everyone who saw him remember him. After his Stampede run, it should come as no shock that Japan came calling. At that time, the biggest star going was Rikidozan, and if you were unaware, he was as big of a star as it gets. He was a Korean wrestler who was world-renowned, and it could be argued he was the biggest star in all of wrestling at the time. Rikidozan would engage in some shoot wrestling, but for the most part, as was with all of them, they preferred to work with one another. Dozan brought in the Great Antonio for a run where he defended the NWA International Championship against him in 1961. The showing wasn't anything that would set a crowd on fire today, but at the time the match overperformed and Antonio was becoming quite the property in the wrestling world. A good way for American fans to see it would have been comparable to John Tenter's Earthquake run in the WWF. Though he didn't beat Hogan, he was in a very solid spot just from being in the ring with him. Antonio would, for the most part, just do his own thing for the next decade or so, as he was entering his middle age and would mostly appear on TV shows and various stage events. Around 1977, a new upstart promotion you may not have heard of, called New Japan, had kicked off and began running shows. Even more interesting, they had requested the Great Antonio for a tour. At this point, our guy is in his 50s and far from his best days. The booking has been criticised for years by bookers, as there has never really seemed like a reason to make the booking other than to try and further cement that Enoki was Rikidozan's successor. But Antonio was hardly going to push this to anyone other than very few who were holding out memories of the bout he had with Rikidozan. At this point, 16 years prior. More questions of the booking are brought up when you realise they had the Great Antonio defeat up to 5 opponents at a time in over 10 handicap matches on the tour, and even the disqualification victory over Antonio Enoki that took place on this tour in the build-up to their infamous bout. The next part of the video is the part that all of you are the most familiar with, the bout with Antonio Enoki. The Great Antonio is by most people only known through this piece of footage. During the match, he is committing a few ring sins, but the one that gets him in trouble is the stiff shots to the back of Enoki's neck. Feeling disrespected and unprotected, Enoki launched into a violent flurry that would see our guy banished from consciousness and inevitably wrestling. The Great Antonio is not recorded to wrestle another match after this match took place, and most would not question why. The beating is pretty thorough, and the man was 50 at the time. Wrestling for most at this point, not just Antonio, wouldn't be an option. going from being the strong man renowned for his feats of strength and fearsome looks, to being reduced to a heap that day in Japan, was something that Antonio never saw coming, and was likely a source of hurt for the big man. Most would end the video there, but in a way, this is the part where things become much more real in the world of the great Antonio. For the remainder of the 1970s and into the 2000s, the great Antonio remained a fixture of the Montreal scene. He was on variety shows regularly and making trips to events, still showing off his feats of strength into his 60s and 70s. In the 80s, he even began landing film roles. During this time, he began producing his own flyers and pamphlets to hand out to people that showed pictures of his feats of strength in pictures from papers he would find in bins, and he would glue the letters of headlines on them to write out messages in the style of a television ransom note or a zine from the local music community. Many of them survive to this day and can be viewed online, and he made them in his free time between these shows he would do. Antonio had a lot of free time, because if you hadn't picked up on by the comment of finding pictures of his feet in bins, Antonio had become a strange figure at this time. Through all of his years, Antonio had claimed to be an alien. Yes, Antonio told people he was an extraterrestrial being. Another surprise to many was that he was married for a long time, and by many accounts, the separation from his wife was what would set him on the path he went. Antonio, though often ridiculed or mocked, also was beloved by the Montreal people. Antonio had stopped bathing and let his hair grow into long locks of mat, and would reinforce these mats with duct tape and metal rings. This allowed him to challenge local children and people to tug-of-wars with his head, to show off a lesser version of his train-pulling feats in his youth. As odd as it seems, the man who most people would look at and see nothing but a Goliath of a homeless man was a beloved member of the community who lived in an apartment, even though he spent most of his days sitting on benches making tug-of-war challenges to locals, passing out his homemade pamphlets, or even challenging people to golf, which he also played with his long matted and duct tape hair. Antonio was never able to be directly reached in his later years. You would have to contact a local Dunkin' Donuts, and he would come by and collect messages once a day or so. During this time, after wrestling and going place to place, his love for singing became more well known, as he would sing in the streets or on variety shows with a surprising voice given his appearance. There are two pieces of footage that encapsulate the end of the great Antonio story. The first, a candid camera type show he did where he would block people inside of a phone booth. The thing that was most surprising was how all of the people were frustrated so much less when they knew it was him, and even laughed at the idea of Mr. Antonio blocking them in. As weird as he looked and odd as he acted, the people seemed to have a genuine love for the quirky giant. This is one view of the life of the quirky giant that people have a laugh with and move on with their day. The second, a man sitting alone, his life in a plastic bag, and waiting for someone to recognise him and ask for a game of tug-of-war or a pamphlet from his bag. At the end, Antonio spent most of his time just wanting to share stories with those who wanted to hear them. In 2003, he didn't have any more stories to tell. After picking up a lottery ticket and sitting at the same bench he'd always sat on, he passed away from a heart attack. Antonio had heart issues untreated for years and never shared it with anyone. It took 9 men to get the great Antonio from his bench, and there is a commemorative plaque there now with dedication to his memory. The great Antonio was originally to be cremated, as he did not have enough to have a proper funeral, but within a short time of his death becoming known, a flooding of support came in, and it was said that people who were mocking him just a week before were at his funeral and finally were paying due respect to someone who had spent most of his life trying to make the people of his adopted home of Montreal smile with his singing or his antics. To many, he was a big, smelly giant deserving of nothing but ridicule, but to others, he was a big, smelly giant that made the world a little bit more colourful and interesting place.
Et ma pourtant je t'aime para toujours.
If you're new here, be sure to hit subscribe. If you liked the video, please make sure to leave a like and a comment below and tell us your thoughts. If you wanted to help out the channel as well, we also have memberships available, and you can check out our Twitch links in the description box below, as well as join our Discord. That's all we have for you today. We'll see you in the next one.